Glenn Diesen here, and I'm joined by Alexander Mercouris and Clare Daly and Mick Wallace. So Clare and Mick are both members of the EU Parliament and currently up for re-election. Welcome.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
So I follow some of the discussions and also the statements coming out of the EU Parliament at times. And well, I must admit, I find the strong consensus in the EU to be sometimes disturbing, especially during wars. In regards to Ukraine, it seems that everyone feels it's a great idea to chant that weapons are the path to peace, reject diplomacy for more than 2 years as hundreds of thousands of young men perish, and we continue with these big steps towards nuclear war and challenge it. You're accused of being on the Putin payroll. In Gaza, we see that support of horrific war crimes and possibly even genocide seems to be normalized. And again, those who challenge it might be then simply labeled anti-Semites, terrorist sympathizer, and Hamas supporter. So again, in this political culture of consensus, I guess we have two MEPs standing out with vocal opposition, which is Clare Daly and Mick Wallace. So with your radical suggestions, such as restoring diplomacy, looking for peaceful solutions. So I want to ask, though, since you are both up for re-election now, how do you see this EU election being any different than before, or is it more important, especially given the EU seems to be taking a bit of a different direction than it had in the past, when things were then was aimed to be a civilian power, ethical power. The language now appears to steering more towards being a geopolitical power, a great power almost. How is all of this relevant, do you think, for this upcoming election?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, we see the backdrop to this election now with Ursula von der Leyen there only a week or 10 days ago, announcing that when she comes back, and it's a when, not an if, probably, that she is going to turbocharge defence. That's her priority now. We know that we're 1 year away from a defence union, and nothing will stop that. We're 1 year away from the establishment of a rapid deployment capacity force, which is a standing troops, combat ready, of initially 5,000, multi coming from all the countries, land, sea and air, ready to go into environments, including non-permissive environments, in which Joseph Borrell has said means boots on the ground. So you're totally right that we see a total ratcheting up of tension, of militarism. Money has been taken from budgets on the environment, on transport, on health, on all of the things that would actually make people's lives better, and it's been put into defence. So we saw in the last parliament that most of the majority were very much on board that. They think that the solution to Europe's problems is more militarisation, that the reason why we've problems is that we haven't defended ourselves enough. It's utter lunacy, of course. The opposite is the case, because the war in Ukraine took place against the backdrop of a much, much more accelerated militarization by Europe. So militarism begets militarism, and the military-industrial complex goes laughing all its way to the bank. They're establishing now a European Union defence industrial strategy as well. So the next commission, they talked the last time about the last commission being a green commission. It wasn't, but in any case, that's another story. But the next one is going to be a war commission, a defence, as in not defence, but a militarist commission, I think.
Yeah, I mean, von der Leyen says she wants a special commissioner for defence next time round. And as we know, defence was called, before the Second World War, there used to be a minister for war, and that became a minister for defence, because obviously war became a less attractive word. But that's what it is for von der Leyen. She wants a commissioner for war. And yet we have Thierry Breton, he's a commissioner that's very hands-on with the industry of military in Europe. And he says now he wants. He was a bit taken aback that von der Leyen said she wanted a commissioner for defence, given that he thought he was that, even though that wasn't the title, right? Yeah. So I was at the meeting where he said, "I thought I was doing that," And he's actually he has envisaged a European Defence Fund of 100 billion. Now, I mean, this is money that would come from the multi-financial framework, which we agree every 7 years. Now, in the past, and according to the treaties, no money could come from the multi-financial framework and go directly to military hardware or any element of defence. But they've literally moved the goalposts without having to revisit the treaties. And now we have European citizens' money lying in the pockets of the military-industrial complex. And we've had people from the military-industrial complex advising us how we should do that and why we should be putting billions into it.
Absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, the European Union started as an economic union. It was supposed to be about the welfare of people in Europe. One of the reasons why people in Britain were won over, the Labour Party in Britain, the Labour movement in Britain, when it existed, was won over to the European Union back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was because it was supposed to be all about workers' rights, improving protections in the workplace. Whether it ever really was, I'm not going to get into a discussion, but that was how it was framed. Now we're not hearing anything about that anymore. It's all about militarization, building up military industries, establishing funds. And by the way, I completely agree with you. I don't see anything in the treaties that provides for the creation of anything like this. In fact, I would say clearly the treaties don't, but that's my view. Anyway, all of that, and this is happening at a time when living standards of people across Europe are under growing pressure, when workers' actual rights are being eroded pretty much in every workplace, and when health systems and social security systems and all the things that people have relied upon are coming under growing pressure still. Now, just to say, there is an election. You're both MPs. You're both up for re-election in that election. Now, one of the reasons I am very keen to see both of you re-elected is firstly because you've both taken a strong stand against this militarization and, talk of war, a war commission. I mean, how could anybody talk about something like that with a straight face and without any sense of embarrassment? But also, I mean, probably because both of you have, are on the left, if I can say that. You actually talk about these things that people worry about: erosion of workers' rights, withering away of welfare things, all of those sort of things that I think most people in Europe really worry about. And one of my big worries about European Parliament elections is that I don't think people generally in most European states are particularly engaged in them, because the European Parliament is an important institution, but one that people are not hugely involved in. And so what tends to happen is that the kind of people who get elected to the European Parliament are those who are very connected with the political machines that exist in the various countries, who, of course, will then deliver the votes that the political machine in Brussels also wants. So it's not exactly a question, but first of all, do you agree with my overall analysis of the situation? I think there are many people who think that because we're under so much pressure in Europe, the elections this year are going to deliver a different outcome. I don't believe that. And the second is, do you agree with me that, I mean, this is a bizarre thing to be doing at a time when living standards are under so much pressure across Europe, and when so many people are worried about other things, about their jobs, their livelihoods, how they're going to bring up their families, what kind of protections they have in the workplace, what the health and social security systems are going to be, and other topics as well.
Absolutely. I would completely agree. And I think most people would completely agree as well. And interestingly, in the last European Parliament elections, I think the turnout was less than 30% in about 7 member states. In some countries, they're compulsory voting, so it was a bit higher. But that disconnect would be enormous in countries like Ireland, where the media don't cover any of the work or the decisions that are made. They just repeat the rhetoric. They just wave the European Union flag, and then they call anybody who stands up against that a Putin puppet and all the rest. And that's repeated and repeated, so that you don't have a critique of the policies that are being engaged in. You don't have an examination of where all this public money is going and the lunacy of war. Instead, you have sloganeering, smearing, and it's become now a sort of a mantra of European politics that the idea of an exchange of views is becoming outdated. They claim to be in a battle of democracy against authoritarianism, but are becoming incredibly authoritarian in that, where a dissenting voice is immediately smeared, where when people protest, they're driven off the streets like in Germany, or they're called anti-Semites or Russian spies or whatever it is. And as you say, the real issues, the bread and butter issues, the reason it was really interesting, the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing said, listen, lads, if you want a reason for why the far right is growing, it's because you haven't built any houses. And that's totally right. And those issues aren't being discussed while they ratchet up the geopolitical tensions or use the migration issue to divert and divide people into, getting all stressed about that. And meanwhile, the boys who are pocketing all the cash are not being examined. And I mean, the project was ever so. I mean, it was always a neoliberal project to develop a new sort of Europe in the interests of big business. That's copper fastened into the treaties, where all the lovely stuff you were talking about, which was sold to the people, of going on your holidays and being able to have your kids study abroad and work abroad and all that nice stuff, workers' rights, social progress. These things were won by people organising in their countries. And yeah, maybe they had the odd directive, but they followed, they never led on that. But what we're seeing now is the mask slipping and European values being the old values of colonialism. And I think that is something that a lot of people are seeing through Gaza, and it's woken them up big time.
Yeah, I mean, we feel that there's probably a deliberate effort to actually make the people feel that the political process doesn't serve their interests and doesn't care about them anyway. And it kind of makes them a lot of people are really frustrated and fed up with politics. They see through it. And we don't have a mainstream media that's remotely interested in explaining, I would say, for example, how the European institutions work, be it Parliament, Commission or Council. And we don't have a government that's interested in giving information either. I mean, sometimes when we have a referendum, and we've had a number of them, and we often have referendums because of the nature of our constitution. But when we do have a referendum, there's an obligation on them to put out information, right? Well, this is never done for the European Union elections. Now, Claire was talking about just over 30% in many 7 European countries the last time. There will be about 50% in Ireland, because we have local elections the same day, right? Without the local elections, obviously, the percentage would be lower. But the problem with 50% is we're independents with no party machine. We just work with a couple of friends and do our best. But the others, our competitors, have huge machines. They spend a fortune and they throw huge numbers at it. They have the money and they have the mainstream media to help them along the way. And the mainstream media is a big factor. I mean, Ireland got its so-called freedom from the Brits 103 years ago. And we've had either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael every day since. Now, that's scary. That's kind of qualifies as a bit of a dictatorship, right? And the reason that there's always been one of them in power, despite the fact that they've been horrifically disappointing in so many ways for so long, the media helps them to stay there. And it helps them just to promote their message a whole lot, whereas we get ostracized, we get deemed. As you say, I mean, because we wanted peace, we didn't support Russia invading the place. We condemned it, despite the fact that it was provoked, as Stoltenberg brazenly told us at our Foreign Affairs Committee. He laughed about the fact that he provoked the war, because he said that we're talking to the Russians in December 2021, and that he said the Russians wanted Ukraine neutrality, back to the Minsk agreements, an end of NATO's easterly expansion, and he says, there are our conditions for not invading Ukraine. And he says, and he laughed and he says, well, obviously we didn't agree to that, he says, right? So, look, but anyways, we fought for peace from day one. We wanted diplomacy and dialogue to commence, but we were written off by the mainstream media as Putin puppets because we wanted peace. And yet, just to show you the distance and the disconnect between the people of Europe and the political class, I mean, within 6 months of the war starting, over 80% of the people of Europe were wanting peace rather than continue to punish Russia. There was a huge survey done by the European Council of Foreign Relations, which is actually an EU body, but it was very expansive. And at that time, they did that only 4 months after the war and starting, and over 70% had already wanting peace instead of continuing to punish Russia. And that became 80% within another 2 months. Yet, twice that year, in the first year of the war, Clare and myself put in an amendment to the Ukraine resolution. And our amendment it called on the EU to maximise its potential to commence dialogue and diplomacy with a view to ending the war and bringing about peace. Over 80% of the MEPs voted against that. They didn't want the war to stop. They didn't want peace. They wanted the war to continue. And if people think that's scary, 6 weeks ago in Strasbourg, in April, the last plenary in April, we had a vote on placing an embargo on EU member states to stop the flow of weapons from EU member states to Israel while the war continued. 4 out of 5 MEPs opposed that. 4 out of 5 MEPs wanted weapons to continue to go to Israel to kill Palestinians. Yeah. We're in a difficult place.
One thing, Claire just mentioned is sloganeering. It really sticks out because when the EU was able to deliver proper economic benefits to all its member states, this could be a foundation for unity. But it feels often now the EU becomes more and more dependent on this sloganeering because I noticed that with the EU debate already actually from the 2000s when everything was spoken about being for or against the EU, being more Europe or less Europe. So you had for example, the Russians, they didn't like the fact that Europe meant moving dividing lines towards their border and excluding them from Europe. The British didn't like that the sovereign powers would go from elected parliaments to the EU bureaucracy. The Hungarians wanted to restore some of their traditional values. So everyone had some different ideas what Europe should be. But instead, we took this contested concept and just said, well, this is Europe. And if you don't support what we're doing, then you're anti-European. More Europe has to be the solution. So what seems to be proper issues, which we should have spoken about, having debates about, was just brushed away with these slogans. And it feels we're doing the same in the current wars, because we're saying, well, we have to be pro-Ukrainian, we have to support Ukraine. But what does it mean? We're toppling their government, suppressing all their elections when the Ukrainians vote for peace platforms, allowing the US to run it as a colony, pushing them to do this offensive, which even the Ukrainians didn't really want to do. It's just we have these slogans which doesn't really mean anything, and we do the same now with Israel, of course, where we say, we have to support the right for self-defense, but who's self-defense? The one occupying the Palestinians, but also shouldn't the Palestinians have the same? So we don't actually discuss what these terms mean. We just come with these slogans, which everyone seemingly want to agree with. But anyways, that was my question. My question was about Ireland, because it's a very unique country in Europe in the sense that it's very independent-minded. They didn't really, we want to avoid some of this militarism. And of this post-Cold War Europe we've been building, it's primarily been built on 2 pillars, which is NATO and the EU. And for the Irish, the EU was the main pillar to grab onto us. This was sold as being a civilian, normative, non-military power throughout at least the 90s and most of the 2000s. But how is society there reacting now if we're now going to make the EU this military machine? And I'm also guessing, is it the French who's pushing most? I mean, if it was the EU was an economic club, the leadership would be cemented with the Germans. If you make it military, I guess it would have to pass the mantle to some extent to the French. How are the Irish addressing this, or are they starting to accept militaristic Ireland as well?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of changes on the top, and there's some changes in the middle, and I suppose when it's been tested, and traditionally there's been a huge affinity amongst the population to our neutrality. People really like it. They like the idea that when our defence forces went abroad, they could only do so under a UN mandate. We were the peacekeepers. We didn't take sides. We talked to everybody, and people liked that. Now, it was always a hypocritical scam in some ways, in that while the people believed that we were neutral, and in name we were, during all of that period, they allowed the US military transit through our airport on its way to theatres of war in the Middle East, or Afghanistan and Iraq. And I mean, when we were in the Irish Parliament, we had hundreds of questions to these ministers, and they try and tell us that there was nothing on the planes. They came every day, like hundreds of thousands of troops came through, but they were just transiting and they weren't doing anything. They were just going on their holidays, like, and there was no weapons on, because the Americans told them there wasn't any, and they accepted their word. So that scam was going on, but they couldn't be blatant about it. And even recently, when they've tried to move, and our government is very Europhile, they're the same types of people who in the past bent the knee. When Britain was in power here, they're the same who bend the knee to US corporations to come in, the multinationals, for all the jobs and the money. And oh my God, what would we do without the Americans? So they're the same type of people who do that. But look, I think they have tried to undermine and push away from that. But even against the backdrop of the massive propaganda of the war in Ukraine, people still said no neutrality. Now they're trying to scare people day and night that the Russians are coming, that we need to defend. We can't be infantile anymore. It's just not in our interest. We've got to grow up, man up. We haven't the luxury of being neutral in this very dangerous world. We've got to cop on. We're not spending enough. And some people, I've actually had one or two people raise that with me this time. Normally in Ireland, if you said, how are we on neutrality? You had to be the biggest, most outspoken person on neutrality, which we are anyway. But a couple of people this time said to me, no, I don't agree with you. We're really unsafe. So there's a move by the Irish establishment, and we're more and more in. So they'll say, NATO, God, we're not going to join NATO. No. We'll never join NATO. But we just want to cooperate with our European peers. But the European Union have made it clear that NATO is the EU, you know.
There was some Russian ships were engaged in exercises about 200 miles or 200 kilometers from our coastline there a while back, and there was uproar about it, right? And this was like, now there's not a word about the fact that NATO ships are around the place morning, noon, and night, right? And that we actually work with the Brits on especially on air surveillance and all, right? So anyway, the idea, I mean, I had this argument came up in a radio interview that I was doing the other day as well, and it was put to be, we have to build an army of our own. We can't be dependent. Europe can't be dependent on America anymore. Ireland can't be dependent on Britain anymore. So it's, we've got to build our own. And I said, well, there's no one remotely interested in invading us. And if they did, if we actually formed an army, we wouldn't be able to form an army that would keep anybody out anyway. It's a completely useless exercise, right? It doesn't make any sense. But the scaremongering about Russia, what's in the media in Ireland is very strong. But you have the same scaremongering coming from the elites in the European institutions. Now, traditionally, foreign affairs was really the area of the council. We have three institutions. We have the council, we have the parliament, we have the commission. The parliament are the only ones directly elected. And as you said, okay, an important institution without being powerful. But it is important because it gives us a platform to raise a voice and to challenge the elites who are serving the elites of Europe and not serving the citizens of Europe in the manner that they should. So it gives us an opportunity by being in the parliament to challenge them. The commission is not elected. They're appointed by the big groups. And the council obviously is made up of the 27 member states, and ministers come. to the council meetings. For example, if there was a foreign affairs meeting, the Minister for Foreign Affairs from the 27 member states would come and they would have a discussion, and most of the talks would be in secret as well. But the truth is that traditionally, the member states at council were very conscious of money, and they didn't want to do anything that would cost their country money at home. Exports in particular, right? Wouldn't want to be hurting exports, right? So they generally tended to do things sensibly rather than think in a geopolitical fashion. But that's changing. And there's been huge pressure on the council members to actually kind of look at the bigger picture from their perspective. We're under threat. It's Ukraine now. Next, it'll be Poland. Next, it'll be the Baltics. I mean, it's so irrational. It's not funny, right? But they are, and when we challenge that, we are accused of disinformation. And the Georgians who have just are trying to introduce the Foreign Agents Bill are being told, "Oh, that's so un-European. Oh my God, the Georgians are looking for a little bit of transparency on how their NGOs are being funded, and anyone that's getting more than 20% of funding from outside the country should declare it." And they're not even asking them to be dissolved. They're asking them to be transparent and admit where they're getting their money, because most of it is coming from the Europeans and Americans. But yet, it's called the Russian law, despite the fact the Americans already have one, and the Europeans are bursting at the seams to bring in their own to deal with the threat of Russia as well. So, I mean, all this rhetoric, they actually can't back it up, and it doesn't make any sense. But sadly, with the mainstream media support, it does have an impact. And some people think, oh God, maybe the Russians will come. And so it does create a fear. And if those people that are worried about the Russians coming, remember then that, we're Russian spies, and we're Putin's puppets. So I mean, it's a vote for us would be dangerous. And the big problem with a 50% turnout is that you have the established parties like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and Labour, traditional parties in Ireland. Their hardcore will be in that 50%. They'll come out. So the bigger the turnover, the bigger the turnout, the better for us, because a whole lot of people, sadly, with politics in general across the world, especially in Europe, a big problem is that the young people are not voting and the poor are not voting, and they're the ones who can make the difference.
Absolutely, and that is entirely correct. And one always almost wonders whether the current structure of politics and the current structure of the socioeconomic system is almost designed to make that happen, in the sense that you really want to create a system which doesn't deliver for poor people, for young people, so as to disincentivize them from voting, which of course thereby perpetuates and consolidates the system. Now, there's just a number of points I wanted to make. I mean, you're both independents, and that's absolutely right. That's very important. And by the way, Ireland has a long history of people who are political independents. If you know anything at all about Irish history, you will know how important that is, and how the fact that there have been all of these people who've been able to come forward, and that's moved. That was absolutely central to Ireland ultimately achieving its independence from Britain. But can I just say, your independence, you are independents. You're also, in my opinion, well within a certain tradition in Irish politics. And it's a tradition which achieved Irish independence, Irish freedom, Irish neutrality being very much a part of Irish freedom, in the sense that if Ireland had not been neutral, it would have been in alliance with Britain. And that would have created all kinds of connections, which Irish people who are breaking away from Britain didn't want to be in. Do people in Ireland understand that if Ursula von der Leyen's vision of a war commission and a defence minister and a budget are created, then Irish neutrality dies, because Ireland is going to find itself not part just part of an alliance, because the EU is more than an alliance. It is an economic union. It's got its central institutions, which are very different from NATO's institutions, at least in theory. I mean, you would have decisions being made about not just Irish foreign policy, or at least foreign policy that determines Ireland, but also conceivably war policy that might affect people in Ireland in all sorts of ways, if it is ever allowed to happen. I would have thought that anybody in Ireland, aware of Irish history, aware of all that happened for Ireland to be free — I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit romantic and sentimental here — would understand that this is an extremely dangerous thing, and that the Ireland that will come out on the other side of it will not be the kind of Ireland that it fought to become for so long, in a struggle, by the way, which in the north of Ireland still continues. But just asking these questions.
Yeah, if you want to take that one,
Go ahead.
People would be shocked and horrified, and would be aware that it's kind of alien to our history, were they to be educated properly enough about the scale of what's going on. That's our first biggest problem. We have been 3 weeks in the campaign, we're more than the halfway mark, and I haven't heard that discussion being aired anywhere. It's the key discussion facing the new commission. It has not featured in any debate or anywhere yet. So there is a huge problem, and all the points Mick made about the mainstream media is a part of it. And I think then what we see is a capture of power by these, in some way, on paper, they're inheritors of those people who fought for freedom, but they've actually flipped and gone full circle. And they're just totally servile to the European project. It's a feature that we see across Europe, maybe less so in Ireland, but we notice it in some of the other countries, that the MEPs who are being elected, for example, they represent parties, but they're educated in these European schools. They don't speak their own language when they speak. They speak English with kind of an American accent, and they want to impress the bureaucrats in the bubble, not represent the people from whatever tradition they come from. So any debate then about Europe is seen to be, you have to follow that line. It's the same point Glenn was making about dissent and cancel culture and all of this. So we're an embarrassment and a disgrace because we did something different. We stood against the herd, and that was so shameful for Ireland, according to the political establishment. But actually, in our history, it was absolutely in line with the way in which Irish people behave, to stand up, to be neutral, to put the hand out to everybody, work with everybody. And we would talk to people all across, and we have been all across Europe, and in every single country, including the ones that the European Union tell us, oh, Sweden has changed now, Sweden has joined NATO. Well, I've been at meetings of hundreds of people in Sweden who are saying, well, lucky ye that you get a choice, because we didn't get a choice and we don't want this. And it's making our country more unsafe. In Germany, in Austria, in Greece, in Italy, we've been at these meetings, and everybody is the same. They're all just completely disconnected. So, I mean, I think if people did know and were educated, they would rebel, because our Tánaiste, our second in command, is moving now to get away at the same time as we've a rapid deployment capacity policy force being set up next year, which is an EU army, small one at the start, but then it's in place, a defence union. He's abolishing our triple lock, which is the means by which Irish troops serve overseas. He wants to allow that to happen without a UN mandate. So it's not a fantasy to say that in a year or two's time, Irish men and women in the defence forces could be going overseas to fight for German fossil fuel interests in Africa, or French ones, and coming home in a body bag. And I can tell you, in the context of our history, that would be an absolute game changer, but people aren't aware of it.
If anyone in Ireland had heard that we were actually going to move away from the UN and go towards this new version, move away from the UN Charter and start looking to the rules-based international order, which the Western powers make up as they go along, people would have been horrified 10 or 15, 20 years ago, horrified. And they'd find it, my God, what's going on? What's going on with the UN? Listen, the UN is very, very far from perfect. But right now, it's as good as we've got. And we've got the UN Charter is our Bible, and we should adhere to it. And sadly, the big Western powers for many years had been ignoring it, but paid lip service to it. Now they're getting tired paying the lip service, and they're moving away from it brazenly, and they're trying to drag plenty with them. Now, that's the struggle for them. When I suppose the European Defence Fund, that was dreamed up first around 2015, and a panel was set up, and over 80% of the people on the panel that were going to advise the Commission about how we should progress around this area, over 80% of them came from the industry. It was a horror show. And lo and behold, they recommended that we start spending billions on building a European Defence Fund because problems are coming. Now, we all know that at this stage, there had been they made a coup in Ukraine in 2014. The Americans admitted spending $5 billion organising a regime change. We know now that NATO were in there advising the troops and training them and whatever. But things have changed since then. And obviously, Ukraine has been a stick to batter Russia with, and that was the plan. Hasn't worked out quite as well as they liked. But the lie about Ukraine is still there, and they're still refusing to tell the truth about it, right? We have a situation now where promoting a war that was unwinnable, we'd have had a nuclear war before Russia would have lost it, because winning to the EU was also taking Crimea back. There'd have been a nuclear war before Russia lost Crimea, right? And yet we continued pouring billions with arms into the Ukraine to make sure the war didn't stop. Meanwhile, they reckon now that close to 300,000 working class kids in Ukraine are dead. For what? We're colonizing the place. I was on the file for the Ukraine facility. This is 50 billion, the latest 50 billion. Initially, it was all about reconstruction. And I was on the file of one of seven, one from each. There's 7 groups in the parliament, and one person is picked from each group to go to the meetings and tease it out, right? And I said, you're pumping billions in on one end, helping to continue to destroy the place. I said, you're talking about rebuilding it at the same time. I said, that's not a good business plan, I said, to be building and destroying at the same time. And it's an awful lot of money. And who's gonna pay the money, right? So anyway, eventually the 50 billion was passed, right? And there's less talk about reconstruction, but more about keeping the show on the road now, right? But okay, but who's paying for it? In actual fact, 1/3 of the money is a grant, 2/3 is a loan, right? And I said to him, now, if you guys genuinely care about Ukraine, give it all to me a grant, but tell the European citizens that their money is going to it. But I said, giving them 2/3 of it in debt is another debt trap. I said, they can't pay back the money they already owe. They're never going to pay this back. So what you are doing is you're colonizing the place. You're going to own it, yeah. And now, as if that's not bad enough, when the IMF gave them a loan in 2021, one of the conditions of the loan was that Ukraine changed its land purchase arrangement. At that time, foreigners couldn't buy land, so that was dropped. So then large corporations from Europe and America could buy lots of 25,000 acres at a time, 10,000 hectares. At this stage, European corporations have bought more land in Western Ukraine than the Russians have taken on the east side. We're saddling with a debt. It's a debt trap that they're never going to be able to pay back. We're going to own the place. What the Russians don't own, we'll own, right? And Ukraine's sovereignty is a long, long piece away, right? And still, we don't mind continuing to throw working class Ukrainians into the meat grinder. Do they care about them? And all the politicians that voted to keep the war going, did any of them go over there and fight? Did any of them send their kids over? They didn't.
It's interesting, the collapse of neutrality. I guess the Irish would feel it's stronger than others given the history of neutrality. But you see this across Europe, from Scandinavia, Switzerland, Austria. I mean, there's across the board, neutrality became not something positive, but something to be shamed. Remember when the United States, they went in to remove Khan in this regime change in Pakistan, the American ambassador there had called it aggressive neutrality, not to take a stand. Same as Stoltenberg now saying, we can't deal with China unless you align with our policies. This idea that you can't, that this is the peak of morality, that you have to join in and expand this conflict even further, as opposed to non-involvement. In this country as well, in Norway, we used to have a rule: we don't send weapons to conflict zones. Well, it's out the window now. It's immoral. We also used to have rules about not having foreign bases on our soil. Now we're going to have literally the whole country with American bases, and we're not debating it, of course. So it's all this happening very, very quickly. But I guess my question was then on how you counter the propaganda, because this cancellation of neutrality seems to be resting, yes, Mick was pointing out as well, a lot on propaganda, because people haven't been told any of the truth about Ukraine in terms, most people don't know that the Ukrainians and Russians pretty much agreed on a peace agreement immediately after the Russians invaded, that this was a way to push through the Minsk agreement. But they're not told. And as also Mick pointed out, in Georgia now, they're trying to replay something similar. You have all these NGOs, stoking this riots. The Prime Minister of Georgia is warning that the U.S. could possibly topple the government there because they want to open a second front against the Russians, and foreign ministers from across the EU are showing up to march with the protesters. I read a Dutch MEP who threatened to sanction all Georgian MPs, democratically elected MPs, who would vote for this law to have some transparency with all these NGOs. They're not real NGOs. It's a non-governmental organizations. These are all funded by governments. And again, my point is, one can argue for this. However, there's no discussion, it seems. When you open the papers, it only says, well, let's either choose Europe and freedom, or you choose the Russian law, and that Georgia will be under Russian control. This is just, it's very dishonest. And I feel some of this goes against the two of you as well, because if you raise legitimate discussions, it's, how much is Putin paying you? Are you Putin troll? We just do these slogans. So how do you cut through this and try to have some, I guess, rational discussion?
Well, I think it's beginning to change. It's beginning to change out of the tragedy of what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, and they can't even hide it anymore. Like even the dumbest of sort of people who don't, from a political level, who don't know anything, kind of know now that there's no hope for Ukraine militarily, and even though they're still pushing them on, that's a basis to it. I do think people feel alienated from that type of labeling. The sloganeering, the jingoism, the flag waving, it's totally vacuous, disconnected from reality. And that's adding to people's sense of powerlessness. I suppose two things happened for us that made it a bit easier. And we do get you should be ashamed of yourself working for Russia every single day when we're canvassing. Well, I do. I haven't met Mick in 3 weeks until now. So we haven't done as well. Yes, we get that every single day.
I even look like a Russian spy.
Every day I have met people every day who said, thank you so much for your position on the war in Ukraine. It was so important for us that there was another voice there. And those voices had been silenced, because when we were in the thick of it, really getting it in the neck, when you were nearly afraid to go home, because of people shouting abuse and all of that, there was always a core group of people who said, thanks a million. They might have been whispering, afraid to say it, but they were really appreciative. And across Europe, they were really... So the horror of the war has made it easier. I mean, there was a survey done last week which says 63% of people in Ireland now believe that the EU mishandled it and they should negotiate. What also changed, and it relates to a point you made, Alexander, earlier that I'd forgotten about, was Frau Genocide herself. Ursula von der Leyen has been the best poster girl for changing the attitudes in Ireland towards the European Union. People are literally transfixed in horror of what that woman has enabled and supported in Israel, but with standing by Israel against the people of Gaza. It's a huge issue everywhere for people. And they've seen, not that some people try to say, it shows they were so supportive of Ukraine. Why can't they support Palestine? We said, no, it's exactly the same. They supported the war in Ukraine. They are supporting the war on the people of Gaza. It's the same thing. And isn't it mad? And it comes back to the other point about how discourse has become sort of debased, is that, and in Ireland, you know, you couldn't accuse somebody of being an anti-Semite because people just laugh at you because they kind of understand the whole history thing and they understand the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But like our position on the two situations were the same. We called for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, and we called for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement in Gaza. But nobody says you're a Netanyahu puppet, because you wouldn't get away with that. But grown men, and they're generally men in my experience, grown men and of a certain age and class standing seem to have bought this line that we are Putin puppets just because of arguing for peace.
Yeah, but I suppose Clare touched on it there, but in Ireland, I see it a bit in mainland Europe as well, but in Ireland in particular, the European Union's failure to condemn Israel after they killed 15,000 children and 10,000 women, and we still haven't condemned Israel. We didn't throw them out of the song contest. We didn't throw them out of the UEFA football championship. We threw Russia out of everything. Russia were thrown out of dog shows. And yet, people are starting to see, especially in Ireland, where the Irish have always had, the Irish people, not the politicians, the Irish people have always had an affinity with the Palestinians because we were there, right? We had 800 years of the Brits, right? And now that's 50 years ago, but the people haven't forgotten it, and it's been passed down by word of mouth, and it's a very powerful theme still, right? So watching what's happening in Gaza, and they cannot even condemn Israel. They cannot call it a genocide. They can pretend, oh, it's just another war. My God, it is really making the Irish people kind of sit back and say, oh God. Now they haven't joined the dots with Ukraine because there was such a job done on the whole storyline around what was going on in Ukraine. They will join them in time. They haven't got there yet. No. But the European Union's position, the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission, their position on Gaza has exposed them like nothing before, like nothing before. And the Irish people are kind of wondering, how I thought the EU was progressive. I thought the EU were good lads. I can't believe this. Yeah. They're supporting a genocide. How can they do this? Oh, I don't understand. But what this has done as well, I mean, the Irish politicians have said some nice words about the Palestinians, but done nothing. Since the 7th of October, under a question in the Irish Parliament about 2 months ago, a question to the minister, how much dual-use weapons have been licensed by the Irish government to go to Israel from Ireland since October 7th. We've sent 31 million euros worth of dual-use weapons to Israel since October 7th to kill Palestinians. Now, the mainstream media are not telling that, even though that's on the record in the Parliament, and there's a video of it, even, right? But this is shocking as well. But the politicians, because the people are so much sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, because the people are like that, the politicians are afraid to say anything nasty about the Palestinians. Now they're prepared to kind of give the Israelis a slap on the hand a little bit, but yet at the same time, when we go into the Council of Ministers meeting in Brussels, when our minister goes in there, what does he do? He falls into line like the rest of the sheep.
Which is why one needs a strong European Parliament, and one needs strong MPs like yourselves who are prepared to go out and speak out. Because if you're not there, I mean, I actually made the point. I'm sure you saw me say it, which is I couldn't bear to watch European Parliament debates any longer if the two of you are not there, because who else speaks out like you do? And that's, of course, what a parliament is meant to be for. That's what parliaments are for, ultimately. It's for people to hold, for elected representatives to hold power to account, which, of course, is particularly difficult within the EU context, given that Ursula von der Leyen, who, by the way, you both take apart magnificently, can I just say? I mean, she's not directly elected in ways that, you know, other political leaders around the world are.
She's not elected at all.
At all, exactly.
She's chosen.
Yeah.
She's chosen, exactly. She's a chosen official. Does anybody make the point, you know, outside yourselves, that, you know, the same people who advocate war and conflict in Ukraine want to send more weapons, want to confront the Russians in every conceivable way, want to set up war ministries and defense ministries, the same sorts of people who attack the two of you are the same people who in Gaza are happy to say absolutely nothing, or perhaps even outspokenly in some cases, by the way, to support Israel? Because I know that in Ireland, the Palestinian issue is important. Both Palestine and Ireland were British colonies at different times. Actually, Palestine became a British colony just as Ireland was gaining its freedom. So, or at least most of Ireland was gaining its freedom. But I mean, you said that some people are beginning to join the dots, but isn't it perhaps obvious when one just takes a step back and looks at this, that there is a connection? It's somebody isn't going to be advocating war in one place and peace and you know, not peace, I'm sorry, no, let's take that back, complicity with another war somewhere else, without there being a connection, without this all being part of the same kind of strategy, a policy of whatever you like, Western aggression, Western imperialism, call it whatever you will. But there is a connection, and that this is, again, if Ireland is a part of that, it is fatal to that which all those people, going all the way back to, you know, the United Irishmen and all of those others, fought for so long.
I would love to say that that was the case. I suppose, I don't know. Do you want to try and answer that?
Well,
It's very, yeah, go on.
First of all, we like to think that all is not lost.
No.
There's always hope, and there's hope in the people. There's not much in the politicians. And the two wars of Ukraine and Gaza have highlighted the huge gulf between how the people feel and how the politicians act. The gulf has never been greater, but also it has never been as apparent to the people as before, from our perspective. We feel that more people see it now than ever saw it before. Whether that's enough to get us elected remains to be seen. But things are changing, right? We still there's so much about the European Union that's problematic, and it's going in the wrong direction, and it's digging a hole for itself, and things are getting worse. We like to think that pressure from the people over the next couple of years can make things different and can change things and force the politicians. Right now, the EU behaves like a vassal state of US empire, and that's hugely problematic. We don't really think for ourselves. We put sanctions on Russia to please the Americans and NATO, and we saw our food prices go up 20% for our citizens. Our energy prices went up over 30%. We sacrificed our own for a US NATO prop. You are. But you know what? The people are not impressed. And they're going to a different place now in their minds. And I honestly, I remain positive that the European project can be retrieved from these warmongers, and that we can become something that's noble and that works for peace rather than war again.
Yeah, no, I mean, Mick is right. Like, I mean, the blinkers are off now. This election, like the last election, all people cared about was Brexit. You know what I mean? They were sick hearing about it anyway. There was no discussion really about Europe and what the project was. You know what I mean? It was, oh my God, we don't want to leave like them. Oh, that's terrible. That's all it was. But now, actually, there is scrutiny like never before because of von der Leyen and because of Gaza. Absolutely, that has changed things. And it has changed things in terms of a recognition of our role as well. And sometimes in a terrifying way, in that we know our voices are heard in Palestine. And were we to lose this platform, no doubt it would be spun as a blow to Palestine and the Israelis would be delighted and all the rest of it. But I mean, your point about how people haven't joined the dots is one that will be the subject, I think, of many PhD studies. Because if you think about it, we were anti-war activists all our political lives. When we were in the Irish Parliament, we broke into the airport at Shannon to search US warplanes. We were in court for days over this. We mentioned neutrality. So with that background, Mick was a businessman when he wasn't involved in politics. His buildings were draped with the thing, no to war, no to American terrorism. So we've a long history. And then this war comes along and people actually believe that we were the ones who support a war in Ukraine, and all of those ministers from Ireland who enabled Shannon to be used, that they somehow were against the war in Ukraine. I mean,
exactly. I mean, you made exactly the point I was trying to make, which is, I mean, anyway, carry on, Claire.
No, I just, it's absolutely mental. Yeah.
Yes, it is absolutely.
I was just going to make my final comment before we run out of time now, and I just wanted to say, because you keep saying this, connecting the dots, and I think one of the reasons why people don't necessarily always connect the dots, and how someone who opposed every war is being seen now as being a supporter of the invasion. It really needs, I guess, for people to appreciate what propaganda actually does, because when you want to encourage people to invade and do this horrible thing, genocide, you appeal to the best in people usually in order to make them do the worst, and this is what. You say we need to support Jewish people because of all the horrible things that were done to them, which everyone would agree with. But then this translates into backing a genocide. Same as Ukraine. We all want to see a free, prosperous Ukraine. But every time they come up with the slogans, but when this translates into policies, it always entails sabotaging peace agreements, sending more and more Ukrainians down to the trenches to die, even though we know the war can't be won. It's just this time and time again. It's always the same thing. Same with Europe. Everyone wants to be pro-Europe. It's our continent. We want stability, but every time we talk about Europe now, it's always taking the knee to von der Leyen. And if you're pro-West, you have to subordinate your foreign policy to the Americans. It's just I wish people would dissect some of the rhetoric and why this peaceful rhetoric they have always translates into war and conflicts. So anyways, I know we're running out of time, so I'll
Well, it was my last remark. I was going to say the reason for that, and it was said so eloquently by our president, Michael D. Higgins, at an event last week when he said he condemned the fact that people had to fight for the space to talk about peace. And then he said, the military-industrial complex is the most dangerous organization in the world. And that's why we're all in the situation. Well, I'm adding the bit, that's why we're all in the situation we're in. He just said the military-industrial complex is the most dangerous organization in the world. And it is. And that's why we have all the problems we have.
And imagine, it was, back in 1960, Eisenhower was the first guy to use the term the military-industrial complex. And he warned the world that this was dangerous and we should be very worried. My last comment is around alternative media. We have the mainstream media have been bought and paid for. The year podcasts, other people's podcasts that we listen. So many people that I know now are starting to listen to more and more podcasts to get their information. And that is so important. And because without transparency, without information, they always told us there was no democracy. And now they don't want to give us truth information. They don't want to give us transparency because they don't want us to see what they're doing. But the alternative media can help people to get to that space and inform them better. And it's so vital that he's continuing to grow.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to make my very fast final point, which is, first of all, I absolutely do want you both elected to the European Parliament, re-elected again. I hope everybody in Ireland understands how important that is. I want to just add quickly to the point about the fact that people are seeing through the smears. I have never known in my lifetime a period when the political class, certainly in Britain, felt as insecure and as doubtful of its control and of its doubts about, the fact that it has the loyalty of the people as it does now. So actually, yes, we are winning. But in order to keep on winning and to consolidate that victory, we need people in the European Parliament and in all those other institutions who will continue the battle for peace and the battle for, protections and living standards, and for the increase in democracy, which we all benefit from, and for openness, and for proper dialogue, and proper modern debate, but also, as I said, who will address the butter issues. All of these things, bread and butter issues, all of these things are connected. We need people in the parliaments who can address the Ursula von der Leyens directly and put them on the spot. We need them there. And that's why I want Mick Wallace and Clare Daly back in the European Parliament after the election, which takes place soon. So that's all I'm going to say. That's my very last final word. I hope there are people in Ireland who are listening. I'm sure there are. And well, you've heard us speak. It's consistent with the Ireland I know, but it's also important for Europe, for all of Europe, and ultimately for humanity as well.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks
for allowing the dialogue. Huge fans. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Best of luck with the re-election and fighting the sloganeering.
Thanks a million. We'll do our best. See you soon. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.